What's up, my wizards? It's Dev and Julie here, special guest Julie from Mtg. We both like Magic. And you know what? I realized we've put like 3 deck techs into Dominaria already, and I haven't done like a super budget deck tech. I feel like I've sort of betrayed the base here a little bit. So I'm going to right that wrong today with a super fun deck that you can build on pretty much any budget. And it's actually a lot stronger than it has any right to be at the price tag. Here's $10 mono red goblins. The cool thing about building goblins in Dominaria is that this deck gets to do an awful lot on a really low budget, you know? Not only can it just win by attacking like a normal tribal aggro deck would, but it has a couple of other paths to the endgame, you know? 26 of our main deck cards can hit the opponent right in the mouth immediately, so we're sort of a burn deck, and if all else fails, we can just ramp into a huge spell to win the game out of nowhere. So this deck has a lot of cool stuff going on for it, and again, only $10, so let's take a look. Well, it all starts with 4 copies of Skirk Prospector, which is actually one of the cards I was most excited to brew with in all of Dominaria. Not just for this deck, but this is a really important card for the Blue-Red God-Fearer's gift deck, too. So there's a lot of different things we're trying to do in Standard with this, but Goblins is actually one of the most fun things you can do with it. We've got over 20 Goblins in this deck, and some of our Goblins create other Goblins, so we can make a lot of mana with this before it's all said and done. Now, I'm actually not going to say everything I have to say about this card right now, because I'm going to bring it up over and over again in the video, so don't think this is the last you heard of it. This is one of the key cards in this deck. Now, normally I just move up the curve when I'm talking about the creatures, but something else I want to just go ahead and get out of the way because it's so important is the 4 copies of Siege Gang Commander. We're going to play all of these that they'll let us play because it's the best card in the deck. Now, this is something else that I'll bring up a bunch of times as we go through the deck because it interacts so well with some of the other cards we're playing. Skirk Prospector is something I've already shown you this interacts with well. This essentially represents 4 mana if you have a Skirk Prospector out. And that's pretty dope a lot of the time if you're trying to cast at least one particular spell that's in this deck. Conversely, though, Skirk Prospector you can use in a number of ways to get this out by turn 3, which is kind of ridiculous. But regardless of how it interacts with the other cards in the deck, the card is just good on its own on a base level. You know, if you're behind, catches you back up on board presence. If you're ahead, usually closes the deal out because it puts you way far ahead. And if you've already knocked some life off of your opponent, well, this represents a bunch of reach for you. So this kind of does everything you'd ever want it to do for an aggro deck at the top end of your curve. But let's go back down to 1 mana on the curve again for just a second to talk about the 4 copies of Fanatical Firebrand that we're playing. This is actually a more important card than it's ever been in Standard because Lana Wells is in Standard now, and that's a great target for Fanatical Firebrand, and it's usually more than worth getting rid of a Fanatical Firebrand to take out a Lana Wells before it does anything dirty. And by the way, you can do that even if you're on the draw, which is pretty important in 50% of the games that you'll play against decks running Lana Elves. So remember that, but you know, it's good for all the reasons it's always been good. Not only is this something else that can just go to the face when we need it to go to the face, but, 1 mana, haste 1/1 can get in a few damage before it actually has to sacrifice. And it can take out a lot of creatures that were already relevant in Standard. Bomac Courier, Earthshaker Kenra, white 1-drops, Dauntless Bodyguard, Sky Marcher Aspirant, Glintsleeve Siphoner, Champion of Wits, there's a ton of stuff. Tokens, Thopters, all of that. This is surprisingly very good against a vast majority of early plays in the field. So Firebrand is awesome. We'll play all 4. We're also going to play a playset of Wily Goblin in this deck, though, because it allows for the best start that we can possibly get. Just going Prospector into Wily Goblin allows us to do all kinds of filthy stuff, like turn 3 Siege Gang Commander and beyond. So, if for that reason alone we're going to play 4 copies, but Wily Goblin's a card that's always been fine on its own, too. It's a body that produces mana ramp, and that's good, pretty much no matter which way you slice it. I've always liked Wily Goblin. We're also going to work in 4 copies of Goblin Warchief, and this doesn't look like it quite does enough yet. It'll probably do way more after Core Set comes out. We see some Goblins, maybe even the set after that. Who knows what the future holds? We'll see. But for right now, this only reduces the casting cost of a few Goblins in our deck, because a lot of our Goblins cost 1 or they cost double red, but one of the Goblins that does reduce the casting cost of is Siege Gang Commander, which probably makes it worth playing Warchief in and of itself, Not only can we get Siege Gang on turn 4 without having to sacrifice anything, Goblins to Skirk Prospector or Treasure from Wily Goblin, we can just sort of naturally get Siege Gang on turn 4, but all the tokens and Siege Gang itself will have haste, which is pretty relevant too. And honestly, even if it doesn't reduce the casting cost of other goblins, it'll at least give those goblins haste. So a little bit of value here. Plus, it's a body. It's fine. It'll attack sometimes. Other times, we'll use it to get mana off a prospector. It's just, the card does just enough to make 4 copies, plus we have to fill out the curve. But to finish off the goblins already, we're going to play 2 copies of Squee the Immortal here, because I want him around, and he will stay around. I'm actually considering cutting this down to 1 copy, because once you see a Squee, he's with you forever, and there's no reason you'd really want to draw another copy of him, you know. But this does all kinds of cool stuff. You know, you cast him 1 turn, and then he leads to mana ramp if you have a prospector out. On subsequent turns, which is pretty cool. And the best thing you can do with the Squee in this deck, at least, is just sack him over and over to Siege Gang Commander. It's totally fine, you know. It costs 5 mana a turn to do this once, but I don't know, compared to something like Hazaret's activated ability, which has been praised for its, you know, ability to close a game out, its ridiculous reach, you know, it costs 4, but you lose a card. This costs 5, and you don't really lose a card. So, I don't know, it does the same amount of damage. I think they're comparable, at least, and sometimes this will help you close out a game. If you got nothing better to do, or you're just drawing lands and you got the mana to do it, 2 damage a turn is reach, and that can sometimes help out a lot. But, if nothing else, even if you're not doing loops and stuff with Squee and crazy tricks, then at least this is a creature that can pester control decks. They can never get rid of it, no matter what they do. Really doesn't matter. So, Squee is ridiculous against all manner of sweepers, even things like Settle the Wreckage and Seal Away and Vraska's Contempt. It really doesn't matter, and Control absolutely hates that. Now, that leaves us room for actually kind of a lot of spells in this deck, and we're going to use all of them to burn face. So we're going to start with the obvious, the 4 copies of Shock, and the 4 copies of Lightning Strike. You know, both of these are good if you're just trying to burn the opponent out. They're awesome for that, but obviously these can pick out a bunch of creatures, like 75% of the format that's popular right now. These 2 cards take out in one way or another. You know, I've already talked about the vast number of 1 toughness creatures that Firebrand takes out. Double that. You know, not really double the number of creatures, but still, Shock does double the amount of damage Firebrand does, and Firebrand's relevant by itself, so do the math. And as far as Lightning Strike goes, this can take out even more stuff, so why not? Why not 4 copies of Strike, you know? But mostly we're playing these for the ability to just race and burn face, but if we have to take out an important threat or we're trying to get through on the ground, these are good for that too. But one of my favorite cards in the deck that I was just sort of ready to just completely right off at first glance was Goblin Barrage. This card is awesome. Like, the worst thing about it is the sorcery speed. With this and the next card I show you, I really wish that we could, like, sacrifice goblins to Skirk Prospector and play these at instant speed. That would be great and would lead to some blowout stuff. If we could cast this in response to a Fumigate or something, that would be crazy, or any spot removal. I would love that. But even given that we can't play those tricks, I still think this is fine with the sorcery speed. 4 mana seems steep, but a lot of times you're going to be taking out the biggest target on the other side of the board and hitting for 4. That is 20% of the opponent's starting life total. That's a lot. I mean, if you draw 2 copies of Barrage in a game, and there's 4 copies in the deck, if you draw 2 copies of Barrage, that is 8 damage if you've got a couple of goblins lying around. Not to mention you affected the board too. You didn't just lose a guy, and so you're down on board presence. You also killed one of their dudes most of the time that you play this spell. And keep in mind, by the way, you don't even have to sacrifice a goblin to this. Like, you can just kill one of their guys and stay exactly as you were on board presence. So this card does a lot. It's actually really, really versatile, and speaking of versatility, you don't even have to lose a goblin to get the second effect. We're playing Wily Goblin in the deck. You can just sacrifice the treasure to kick this if you want to. So there's a lot of damage on this. It feels like a shrapnel blast. Cost a lot more, but it hits 2 different things. You know, kills the creature and hits the opponent for a lot. Goblin Barrage is great, even if you only draw the 1 copy, but drawing any more copies of that than that in a game can sometimes just seal the deal. That's a lot of damage at one time. Speaking of a lot of damage at one time, though, last card in the main deck, and I couldn't help myself, there are 2 copies of Fight with Fire in here, and I'll fight you about that. Seriously, I love this card. You know, just like Goblin Barrage, by the way, if you don't kick this, it's still fine. Again, I don't really like the sorcery speed, but that's where all of the negative aspects of this card end. You know, that's where the positives start, and the positives are all really good. 5 damage to a creature is a lot. That's an awful lot of damage. But if you kick it, you get all sorts of options. You can just blast them for 10 right in their stupid mug, or you can just take out like half the board and then hit them for 3, 4, 5, whatever's left over, you know? So this is a really versatile card if you can kick it, and you can kick it, believe it or not. If you've got the mana to play Siege Gang Commander, just hard cast it. And you've got a Prospector out, then the next turn when you untap, you'll be able to kick a Fight with Fire. You can do that, you know, you've got 5 lands and then 4 goblins plus Skirk Prospector. So really you've got 10 mana and you only need 9 to kick it. So that's actually, it's not as hard to kick this as you might think. And obviously any other goblin in the deck can sacrifice to help kick this as well, given that you have a Prospector out. So kicking this is not super tough, but again, even if you don't kick it, it can still take out really important creatures and help you get through on the ground. That's good enough. Now, we're playing 24 lands in this deck. Seems like a little bit too many, but we're trying to get to a 5-drop Siege Gang Commander, and we're trying to kick Fight with Fire sometimes, so we need all the land drops, you know? And even though 24 lands seems like a lot, that's something else I like about Fight with Fire. You know, it turns what would normally be, you know, crappy land draws on turn 6 into something you can actually look forward to. So there's that. But in any case, I think 24 lands is right here. And we get to play all 4 copies of Sunscorched Desert, just yet another card that can hit them right in the dome, and we need as many of those as possible. Now, as I usually do for these super budget decks at the beginning of formats, I don't have a sideboard drawn up, but I do have some things that you'll definitely want to play in your sideboard regardless of what your F&N is. So, with that in mind, you definitely want to play some number of Chandra's Defeat, Abrade, and if you're on a low enough budget, Puncturing Blow is a card that I want to bring up again, even just in passing. I've talked about this card before, but for just 5 cents, this can take out a Scarab God forever, which is going to be really important in most metas regardless. You know, local meta or Grand Prix, that's going to be important. So this is the cheapest card in Standard that can take out a Scarab God. You should play Puncturing Blow if you're worried about the budget. But as far as Defeat and Abrade, these are just obvious. Shouldn't have to talk about them too much. You should definitely play some number of these in your sideboard. But I would like to use this time to talk about some cards I didn't play that you could, starting with some Goblins that didn't make the cut. Goblin Chainwhirler isn't in the deck because it costs too much. Just a couple of copies of Chainwhirler cost as much as this whole deck costs. So if you have an extra $20, $25, you can put a playset of Chainwhirlers in, it definitely goes. But as far as the other stuff, there's Rigging Runner and Goblin Trailblazer. Now, Runner's only 10 cents, Trailblazer's only 5 cents, and I am drawn to both of these. Runner and Trailblazer both let us get in early game damage, which is something this deck actually really wants to do. It wants to hit for a little bit in the early game and then get all of its reach off of Siege Gang or maybe even kicking Fight with Fire. But you need to do early damage in order for those cards to translate into wins in the late game. So cards like Runner and Trailblazer could get in that early game damage for you. It's also kind of attractive that Goblin Trailblazer is a card that Goblin Warchief can reduce the casting cost of. And we really don't have a whole lot of those in the deck right now, so I'm sort of liking that. I'm digging that a little bit, but in the end, I felt like all the cards we're already playing are better than these 2 cards, and I don't want to cut down on some of the 4-ofs that we're running to make room for these. I think what we're playing is already stable enough and executes its game plan. Now, some basic weirdness that's a little bit out of budget that you could play in this deck, the Immortal Sun and Vanquisher's Banner. Now, I think that if you wanted to ditch, say, Fight with Fire, you would be losing a good removal piece and a great way to end the game, but you would be gaining something like Banner or Immortal Sun, which lets you draw more cards and is an Anthem effect for a deck that, unlike most tribal decks, don't have Anthem effects. But finally, some non-budget options that you could put in the deck. I've got 3 of these, but really I think this deck could shift from being a pure Goblins deck to being more of a mono-red ramp deck. You know, the combination of Skirk Prospector and Siege Gang Commander, and even Wily Goblin. All of those cards could stay in the deck if you wanted them to. But you could take out all the other Goblins and some of the burn and play Chandra, Jaya, and possibly even Karn. The reason I say Karn is because this deck really needs to draw cards. You know, it fires blanks by turn 6 very, very easily, most games. So drawing cards is something the deck wants to do. And I guess another edge piece of tech is that if Goblin Barrage was still on the list, Karn could poop out a little artifact construct dude, and you could, sacrifice that to Goblin Barrage. So there's other tech with Karn. It's just a solid card. But Chandra could also help you, quote-unquote, draw cards. Deck really needs to do it. And she can ramp you too. She can kill creatures. Just Chandra's obviously one of the best cards in the format, but it would also contribute to the ramp theme. And Jaya, you can only play instants and sorceries with her make a bunch of mana ability, but it looks really good when it comes to kicking a fight with fire. With a deck that plays 4 fight with fire and it's just more dedicated to ending the game by kicking it, then Jaya Ballard might actually be a good card. You could get 3 mana towards kicking it, or you could draw a bunch of cards to try to find fight with fire in the first place. And she only ticks up. You'll never tick her down. So eventually she'll get to ultimate and allow you to kick a fight with fire out of the graveyard. So I actually think if you were trying to build a straight up mono red ramp deck, Jaya would be a huge part of that. Probably going to build that deck. But in any case, here are your power rankings right here. A final score of 61, which is way higher than this deck should be because it's only $10. This might actually be one of the highest scoring, $10, $15, $20 decks that we've ever done. They don't usually get this high on the scale, and that's because the deck is actually pretty versatile. Note the above average versatility. We've got good removal in this deck, plus a pretty strong ground game. We've got some early game stuff that we can run out for some early damage. Plus we've got reach in the form of burn and siege gang and fight with fire and goblin barrage. There's just so much burn in this deck that can target either the player or creatures. That leads to a good defense score and a fairly high offense score too. We're above average in categories that usually make for a very good deck, and this deck can steal wins. Try this thing out, man. It's only $10. It's not too much out of your pocket. You can build this on most budgets, and you probably already have a lot of these cards. You've got your playset of Shock and Lightning Strike. If you did the pre-release or you ordered a box or whatever, then you've probably got a lot of these common and uncommon goblins and stuff. So it's not a super hard deck to build, and it's a lot of fun. And honestly, it might not look crazy right now, but as soon as you kick a fight with fire on turn 6 and win the game, then you're going to be like, okay, maybe, possibly. So try this thing out. It's a whole lot of fun, and it's got a lot of ways of winning the game. And if you are interested in ordering this deck list, or even just looking at the deck list without watching the entire video over again, just click the first link in the description. That'll take you over to my friends at TCG Player. They help sponsor my content, and they're generally friendly folks. I talk to them. They're good people. But they also happen to be where you can get this deck online for the cheapest right now. You don't want to overpay for cheap cards. So you don't want to pay $20 for a deck that could just as easily cost you $10. Click the link in the description. Order from TCG Player because not including the price of basic lands, this deck is right at about $10 right now. So if you do have to buy the mountains, you get out of there for like 11 or 12 bucks. It's a steal. Even if you're just going to goldfish with this deck, it's a fun deck. But take it up to F&M, you'll probably win some packs if you play smart. This thing is actually better than it looks. But anyway, we're tapped out for now. Just make sure you do all the stuff. Like the video if you liked the video. I hope you did. Put a lot of work into these, so I hope you enjoy them. But you do all the other stuff too. Sub if you're new. Hit the bell for the notifications. Tons of deck techs coming out. You can also follow me on Twitter at SBMTGDev or throw me $1 on Patreon to not only know what decks are coming out next, but help determine what decks are coming out next in some instances. So throw me $1. It's a pretty good deal. $1 a month, and you get to affect history itself. So do that. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to. And whew, it feels good. It feels good to do a really, really budget deck tech. And Dominaria actually makes for quite a few of those. So I'll definitely see you back with a couple more of these during the season. But in any case, I'm Deb from The Place, and I'll catch you cats later. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.